Europeans had tapped into the existing African slave trade as early as the 1480s. And by the 17th century, European powers had decided to base their American economies on the transatlantic slave trade, the capture and purchase of Africans and their transport to the Americas for a life of slavery. A Dutch ship brought the first enslaved Africans to Jamestown in 1619. But early on, European colonists preferred European servants. Starting in the Virginia and Maryland tobacco fields, European servants worked alongside a small but growing number of Africans in horrendous conditions with terrible mortality rates for most of the 17th century. As plantation farming increased, colonial planters demanded more cheap labor, and in 1689, the king granted English traders the right to participate in the trade. After that, the enslavement of Africans expanded, leading to the growth of shipbuilding cities like Liverpool and slavery spreading across all the colonies by 1700. Controlled by the Dutch, along with the English and French shippers, the transatlantic slave trade consisted of 3 stages: supplying specialty goods such as weapons and cloth to Africa to trade for slaves, transporting Africans to the Americas on a journey known as the Middle Passage, and shipping American products such as tobacco and sugar to Europe. The slave trade reached deep into Africa's central interior, from which captured Africans endured forced marches to the West Coast. It is estimated that half the captives died on these treks alone. After suffering in dungeon-like slave castles on the west coast of Africa, these newly enslaved people experienced the even more horrific Middle Passage. Slavers usually branded and then chained enslaved people to packed sleeping platforms underneath the ship's main deck. These spaces were so cramped that people could neither turn over nor stand up. Ventilation was poor, and frequently there was insufficient space for waste buckets. If good weather prevailed, sailors even forced the captives to do exercises on deck. Africans resisted the brutality of the Middle Passage. Many refused to eat, preferring to starve to death instead of enduring captivity. Some jumped overboard, and in some rare cases, they were able to free themselves from their shackles and revolt. Conditions were so dire that it is estimated that 13% of the captives died on each voyage. Over time, a strong counter-movement to end slavery developed. Many whites and runaway slaves spoke against British participation in the slave trade. In 1787, the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade formed, and British Parliament passed the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act into law in March of 1807, making the slave trade illegal throughout the British colonies. In 1807, Congress likewise passed the act to prohibit the importation of slaves, and the ban went into effect on January 1st, 1808. Nevertheless, while these laws halted the importation of enslaved people, slavery itself would endure in the United States until 1865.